very late, as you're all aware, and each speaker is going to have 20 minutes to present, and then we're going to have half an hour for questions. So, without further ado, and because you can read their profiles in a magazine, I suggest you start.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you to all the organizers, Carl, Gareth, Lucinda, Gugu, Dylan, Noma, and everybody else. It's been a pleasure, and it's also been very interesting to be here. If Carl was taking credit, he's not in the room right now, so he was taking credit earlier today for putting together a standing panel. I think he should get some of the blame for having me here today as well, because I'm not an expert in violence or crime. I study street vendors in Sao Paulo, and I also do not have research on crime and violence. So I told him when he invited me, I said, the best I can do is present a research project that I have, that I submitted recently, and that was not funded, actually. And he said, sure, let's do that. So that's what I'm gonna present. It's a research proposal about crime and violence in Latin America, and this is part of a transition that I'm currently making from my previous ethnographic work on street vendors. I will, well, I'm gonna tell you what I had planned as a research program, and then I'll also try to connect some of the concerns, maybe the more theoretical concerns in that program, with the concept note of the colloquium. So maybe a more theoretical discussion can come out of that. I'm going to start in an unusual manner for me by telling a kind of a personal story, which inspired the big question behind this research program, and that's that I'm from Ecuador, and when I was a kid, my grandmother would take me to the beach sometimes, the Pacific Ocean. And at night, when you sat on the beach, you would see a lot of little bright lights when you were looking at the ocean. So there were all these little bright spots in the horizon, and those were the lights of the fishermen boats. You could see them. You couldn't see the boats, but you could see the lights, right? I went back to Ecuador. I mean, I go back to Ecuador regularly, but I went back to the coast about a year and a half ago. And at night, when you sat on the beach and you looked at the sea, you didn't see any lights at all anymore. It was completely dark. And I was surprised, but I only found out the reason the next day when we went to buy fish on the beach. And we approached the fishermen who were just coming back because they fish at night. And I asked them, I said, what's going on? I remember as a kid, we could always see you in the dark with your little lights. And they said, well, we don't use lights anymore when we go fishing. And I said, why? And the answer was the pirates. We don't use lights anymore because if you are out there at night and you can be spotted by those lights, well, what happens is that pirates come, armed pirates, of course, and they steal the engine from the boat, and they lift you adrift, right? So now fishermen have to fish in the dark, okay? And to me, that was, I mean, that's not directly related to this research project, but that suggested a shift in how daily life unfolded on the coast, and which paralleled changes that also happened in urban areas including my hometown, Quito, the capital, were mostly between those same years, so through the 90s and early 2000s, urban life became increasingly violent, right? And muggings became more frequent. And so I decided in this research project to try to understand more of the macro dynamics that were underlying this transformation, which to me felt like something that was happening mostly in pretty much every realm of social and economic life, from the ocean to the capital city. And again, like, I had no expertise whatsoever on this topic, and so I started by looking at like very macro level statistics on crime. And what I found in a report that's based in UNODC statistics was that indeed, in the second half of the 80s and first half of the 1990s, there was clearly a very strong spike in homicide rates, which is portrayed in this picture, right? In this graph. And so in the course of 10 years, whereas the median homicide rates had been more or less stable at around 8 per 100,000, this is country level, so it's high, they went up to 12. And the question basically that this research program tries to answer is why? Why did this happen? And there is, of course, there are different narratives and there are different theories, and the one that you find in most ethnographic research on violence, and there's a lot, including some of which we have seen today, and some of which has been conducted by my advisor and co-organizer of this colloquium, who is not here, Javier Riera. And usually, at least in the ethnographic studies that I have read, especially his, the introduction of the book or the paper will mention neoliberalism as basically the broad explanatory factor of this transformation towards essentially generalized violence in social life, and then we'll delve into more of the micro mechanisms and experiences of that violence in specific places, right? In his case, it's mostly poor neighborhoods in the outskirts of Buenos Aires. And so the broad narrative in that kind of studies, and again, I do not know the whole literature about crime and violence in Latin America in detail, but the large narrative is that essentially neoliberalism, and there's some controversy about when exactly does it begin, but basically since the 1970s and 80s, increased poverty, increased inequality, and that this led to an increase in crime and violence. And as someone who studies informal economies and who is more familiar with the literature on economic informality, I thought, well, is there something else? How can I dig deeper into these causal relationships while not necessarily challenging the broader idea, the broader claims about neoliberalism being the broad causal force behind this transformation of social life, right? And so what I did, because and it was also sort of a strategic decision in order to justify the choice of, the question that I was raising for reviewers of my proposal, I thought of considering the informal economy as the concept in which I would ground the theoretical model through which I would try to make sense of this transformation. And there are a set of propositions, theoretical propositions, that have been more or less established and accepted about informal economies. One of them being that they are diverse, There are different kind of trades that fall into this broad category, which used to be referred to as the informal sector, and is now more often referred to as the informal economy, or in plural, informal economies. So street vendors are as one category, the occupation that I study, but usually paid domestic work is also an informal occupation. And then there are all sorts of like manufacturing occupations that are also informal, to the extent that the work being carried out is not declared, or that the firm is not registered. And one of the key findings of the literature on informal economies at the beginning, so in the 80s and 90s, was that there were strong ties between formal manufacturing concerns, large companies, including transnational companies, multinational companies, and informal producers, right? These economies fed off each other. And so there were different mechanisms, different supply chains through which these linkages worked. One of them being, of course, outsourcing of some like key production operations to informal businesses. Another one being distribution. Goods that were produced in large manufacturing in factories that were declared, and etc., would be distributed through informal networks of vendors and other informal businesses. So there were these ties, and these ties explained to some extent the fact that when there was economic growth and during the era of industrialization in the post-war period, the share of the informal labor force did not decrease, and it did not decrease to some extent, because it was dependent and it fed off industrial activity, right? Formal manufacturing activity. So that's one of the premises that was established by the literature on informality at the beginning. And of course, with broadly speaking neoliberalism and with deindustrialization, those ties were bound to transform themselves. And so the consequences of that transformation, the consequences of deindustrialization in terms of its impacts on informal economies, I felt had not really been investigated. The last point about informal economies that goes into the framework of this research proposal is its relationship to criminal activity, criminal economies. There is an important analytic distinction between informal and criminal. Usually informal means that there is an infraction of minor regulations, not criminal law. And it is also the classic distinction proposed by Alejandro Portes and Manuel Castells is that informal economies, they produce and distribute in illicit ways. So, for instance, without paying taxes, goods and services that exist in formal markets, right? So, in formal markets. So, you can have an informal market for shoes, you can have an informal market for haircuts, for instance. You cannot have an informal market for cocaine, because those are goods that are forbidden by law, and therefore that would be a criminal economy. But there's always this relationship, and that relationship also informs how informal work and informal practices are talked about. And oftentimes they are branded as criminal, even though they are not criminal in that sense, and they do not infringe on penal law. Now, with those premises, the model that I propose to test in this research proposal was hinged on this transformation of the informal economy and the transformation of its ties to these other economic realms, which are the formal economy and the criminal economy. And so the idea is that pre-deindustrialization, you had a formal sector that was large. It was large in part because of state policies that promoted manufacturing activity, and you have an informal sector that has a significant overlap with the formal economy, and that was reasonably large, but that would then grow bigger with deindustrialization and economic restructuring. And on the other hand, you also had, of course, a criminal economy, but that criminal economy was not necessarily overlapping with the informal economy to the same extent that I hypothesize in this project it would 10 or 20 years later as a result of deindustrialization and structural adjustment reforms. And the idea is that nowadays, in this new globalized economy where you have rise of the service sector and a consequent shrinking of the manufacturing sector and the formal economy, the informal economy grew, and that is statistically proved by data from the ILO, but also, I argue, the overlap between informal activity and criminal activity increased. So you have, and it's not reflected in the graph, I'm sorry, because I had to redo this graph last minute because it didn't show on the PowerPoint, apparently because I use a Mac, but there's an increase in the volume of criminal activity, that's clear, like more drug dealing, for instance, but there's also, at least that's the hypothesis that I make, there's also an increase in the overlap between the criminal economies and the informal economies, which are less tied to the formal manufacturing or service industry, and more intertwined with criminal activity. So that was the model that I proposed to test, and I do not have enough time to go into the details of how I was going to test that model, but the idea was to carry out a multi-method analysis in which I would first track what happened at the country level, at the macro level, and track trends in both deindustrialization and informality and crime, and see to what extent those were correlated. And then I would do some case studies in the cities that I know best, which are São Paulo and Quito, both of which went through both processes on a very different scale, of course, but both processes of deindustrialization on the one hand and an increase in crime rates. And the last part, and maybe this is the one that I'm gonna dwell on a little bit, and this will conclude my presentation. The last part that I think is maybe the least explored in the literature was a more biographical element about how in this area, in the area where you have the overlap between informality and criminality, how people actually operate and how they perceive those boundaries and when do they cross them. And so the idea was to interview informal workers in different trades. So I already interviewed many street vendors when I did my dissertation research, but I was not looking at the boundary, at what they considered illegal and maybe legitimate or even legal in their day-to-day practices. I got some insights into that. For instance, one of them told me that it's okay to reproduce the logos of famous brands on the products that you sell, so long as you do not reproduce the design of those products. That was her way of perceiving the boundaries between illegal, legitimate or informal, and illegal. But then, of course, like there are many other practices where this question would raise, and so my plan with this research proposal, which I'm probably going to resubmit after revising it extensively, was to dig into that and take life stories of people who went through that transition and to see how that played out, and whether it was related or not with, to the extent that you can actually prove this, with structural changes in the role of the manufacturing sector in the economy. So that is more like the set of questions than the findings or results, since I haven't carried out this research yet. But I'd like to conclude by making a couple of remarks to perhaps tie this to the concept note and the broad questions that are raised in that concept note for this colloquium about violence as an inherent part of a process that you may refer to in different terms, but I think the terms that the authors of that note use are modernity or civilization. And the idea that violence is inherent to that process, for one, but that it tends to disappear over time, at least in the way that the narrative is constructed in the Western world. And I feel that if you take at least some countries in Latin America, you also have this process. I mean, for whatever role that violence has historically played in the making of those societies, and it's obvious that we have our fair share of imperialism and colonialism, and that violence never disappeared completely from day-to-day interactions. There was still a moment in the history of some of these societies where violence was not as routine and as widespread as it has since become. And I think that's, I mean, I don't even have a claim or a theory to put forward in relation to that, but it should be taken into account that if you want to think of the historical trajectory of the West as going towards pacification and maybe like experiencing some kind of reversal nowadays, that also applies to some extent to Latin American societies. And perhaps also African societies, though I know much less about those. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacinto. We went only 2 minutes over, so you also get 2 minutes. Cool.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to use this opportunity to expose some ideas and some work that's in progress in the hope of getting fierce criticism from you guys. What I will do is to go along a cold chain and look at its different violences that we've identified so far, compare it to some theories of ecological violence that exist, the last one being a homegrown version in South Africa, and then run it through a short history of the minerals energy complex and end up with proposing 3 concepts of ecological violence. So it's a little bit like, for those of you that are fans of MasterChef, it's cooking in a hurry before an audience. So, environmentalists often worry about why environmental issues and also environmental violence is so invisible. But at the moment, we have the advantage in South Africa that coal is completely in the spotlight. We are a very coal-dependent country. For our electricity, we are a very high greenhouse gas emitter, and we have a political situation where the electricity parastatal is in extreme trouble and is often discussed about whether it's going to wreck the whole economy and whether we can save it. We also, and this is closer to our work, are in there's growing opposition both to the immediate effects of coal mines and coal-fired power stations, as well as the broader issues of climate change. And these two debates support each other and lead to the very important debate about the shape that the energy transition would take in South Africa. So, to just give you some background, if what you're looking at here, this green section is called the Central Basin Coalfield. South Africa actually has 17 different coal fields, but of different types of coal and so on. So I'll be mainly talking about this area with some references to the Waterberg up there and some Kele up here. Now, I've been busy with coal issues for about 10 years, and I have worked also with a number of people, particularly today here, Jackie Koch and Denise Skusana, with part of our swap coal research that's ongoing at the moment, as well as with an NGO called Groundwork, and my co-author there, David Hallows. So, in doing this work, we can see 7 different types of violences, and it may be more, it may be fewer, when you look at the whole coal production change. So the first one is this violence against nature, what some might call a war on nature, basically making the earth unlivable, whether it's through immediate damage to ecosystems or whether working through the weather system in the form of climate change. Of course, it has immediate effects on the bodies who live in those affected landscapes. Then there's direct violence, and as Alinka has given very good examples, it's intimidation, it's assassination, it's destruction of property that people feel that happens to people who are living close to these coal installations. There's the violence of dispossession, forced relocation, degradation that make other land uses impossible. There's psychological violence, enforced relocation, and also the division of communities by mining companies where you can no longer trust your neighbors. There's a spiritual violence imposed with the removals of graves, which has the immediate effect of distancing you from your ancestors and from their presence and advice. And then a cognitive violence that imposes monetary valuations and disregards all the richness of how people see and use their environments. So I want to look at a number of theorists to see what is possible, how to organize these things conceptually. So most people are familiar with Nixon's idea of slow and invisible violence, which is basically the poisoning of the web of life, so that it seeps into people's bodies, it seeps into your livestock, into the water, everything you may want to use to support yourself. Some of this violence is invisible indeed, but in the case of coal, it's often very spectacular. So the blasting in an open pit mine that makes a dark cloud, makes a huge noise, smoldering heaps and so on that you can really see easily. So there's a question, does it become invisible because it's been normalized in some way? So I must immediately say I didn't take this photograph, but I am using it. These kids near Imalahleni, at the center of that central coalfield, are swimming in acid mine drainage. So they will, when they go home, as their parents told us afterwards, they will have rashes on their skin. They will have been swimming in water with heavy metals. This is a failed attempt at treating acid mine drainage. So here you can see in the same area, these are the scientists working on understanding what the acid mine drainage contains. So acid mine drainage, in short, water that runs through coal mines and and pick up toxic materials. So, very similar but focusing more on cognitive aspects is Auliero's idea of toxic uncertainty. So people in polluted environments may deny the dangers that they are exposed to, they may misunderstand them. It may be on purpose, there may be other reasons. But secondly, there's also, in most cases, a very definite layer of confusion. In other words, misleading statements and behavior by figures of authority. And in some cases it might not be intentional, as when the media just follows a story, but leaves behind a community that's confused and that may be scared. Then there's the work of Martinez Alier, where he looks at contestation, and particularly, so basically people defend their livelihoods, they defend their families, they defend their environments. And an interesting aspect of this is again a type of cognitive violence that happens when the languages of the powerful exclude the languages and the concepts of the people who are actually have their environments polluted or their livelihoods taken away. So here you can see an example of this, the Sonkele mine in the coastal province, KZN. It's just coming closer and closer to this dwelling and to the livestock. Here is what we see as an assassination attempt. The Sonkele leader in that same area was speaking out. They managed to kill his cat. They managed to burn his truck, and they didn't manage to burn down his house. So, a good example, I won't read all of this, but those who speed read can follow, is somebody we interviewed in Sonkele, myself with my two colleagues, Mr. Charlie. So what you can see in here is how there's a very narrow view of the mine, of the damage they are doing to him. So when he can prove that they've killed a goat by a rock from the blasting, they'll pay. If he finds other dead goats or his goats don't return and he can't prove his case, they won't pay. They say they're relocating, but they're relocating to another town, another area. They're relocating to a farm without a house. And most of all, they're relocating into another community where he will probably live the rest of his life as an intruder, with problems of people who may already be squeezed for space, and then he's forced to join them. When he tried to talk to a television crew, telling the story and his perspective, he was intimidated and he was. They interfered. They found him. They took his family's graves out, but they didn't do it in a satisfactory manner. So there are layers and layers of violence in one specific case, and you don't really see all of those layers of violence until you listen very patiently to the story that's told. Now, the final sort of conceptual framework I want to put here is environmental justice movement in South Africa. A number of our researchers have developed 3 core concepts that we also use in the environmental justice school because it's easy to teach, and I all start with E. If you enclose, so these are the mechanisms that produce environmental injustice, and it's mostly work from polluted communities, or as we call fence-line communities. Enclosure refers back to the early capitalist enclosure of the commons. So you can enclose resources, territory, or imaginations and leave the people who live there with no alternative. That's a basic operation of capitalism. the externalization of costs, so it takes from a more mainstream economics, but it radicalizes the notion because it's a form of theft. The costs are not borne by the producer, by the mine or the power station, but the costs are borne by the people who live there. Exclusion from decision making really refers to a type of politics of knowledge, but also to a straightforward who is able to make the decisions and whose agendas count. So,
Victor, that's 10 minutes.
excellent, thank you. South Africa has been fortunate to not to have a minerals energy complex, but an analysis of it, which is a reorganization of the way we view our economy. So what these authors did in this concept was to show that the mining economy is present through the rest of the economy by taking the physical processes from mining to beneficiation, and also looking at how the capital that was accumulated through the original mining processes determined the structures of the companies that are prominent in our economy. So what is possible with this analysis of a minerals energy complex is to make it really physical, to look at the landscape with its mines, with its power stations, with its electric grid, with its big mine heaps of mining waste, and with the polluted rivers, and see it really as a landscape. It brings it down into a much more material sense. But also you can then look at these mechanisms and how they work. And even if you look very quickly at the minerals energy complex, or in another way, our history as a mining colony, you can see the land grabs, you can see the water grabs, you can see the very harsh processes of excluding people from decision making. You know, colonialism, apartheid. And then the externalities, which are really the social and environmental costs that went into making the minerals energy complex. It's the migrant labor, and a part of migrant labor that is often forgotten, but I think that Anika pointed to, the Bantustans, the sending communities, how the mining capitalists actually squeezed a subsidy out of those poor communities by paying the mine workers far less than it cost them to survive. So, what I want to propose, if you take all of these perspectives, I want to propose three types of ecological violence. The one is inherently very ecological. It is a violence that poisons and disrupts the web of life, changes the climate to a planet that's difficult to live on. As a consequence, it affects people's bodies in their landscapes subjected to eco-violence and results in daily suffering. So this violence works through chemical, physical and biological processes. It's because everything is connected, and because we people as bodies are part of nature, and we cannot escape the pollution that happens in this. So it refers very much to Nixon's conceptualization. And here's an illustration. This is I don't have time for an analysis of, but the various mining processes literally poison the soil, the water, and coal burning poisons the air. So here you can see what a dangerous environment that's created in this landscape. The smoke you see is actually fires that burn underground, and we have informal miners called zama-zamas that go into these very dangerous places to mine the remaining coal. And the reason for it is that the rehabilitation has not been done properly, the mines have just been abandoned, and the reason for that is very poor regulation by government and then coal companies that take the gap. This is what it looks like from the air. So there are vast landscapes on the Highveld that have been disturbed in this way and that remain dangerous for the ecosystems and the people there. Then a second type of ecological violence I would call ecological contestation that contains violence or that can turn violent. So this is a type of politics, and it refers to the arguments and the outcomes in actions that coerce, impoverish, forcefully remove, tear the social fabric, intimidate, assassinate, and divide communities. So this owes very much, this owes quite a debt to Martinez' earlier notion of contestation and languages of evaluation, but it brings together many of those 7 violences identified before. So, for example, thank you. One of the mining towns called Carolina had a acid mine drainage spill that took out the town's water supply. So all the water became acidic, and for 7 months people didn't have water. So people would just go and fetch water from fountains and springs in town. After a couple of months, it turned into a protest, and what you see here is people running away from the tear gas as the protests were broken up. So you can see here is an example of how a dynamic which led to violence of a situation which was basically a pure ecological violence to the water supply. Then finally, an interesting concept to consider is that of systemic social ecological violence that is part of or implicit in a social, legal or governance system such that it's normalized or legitimized as acceptable practice. So when thinking about this and thinking through this, what is striking about this systemic violence is that it necessarily contains the concept and practice of sacrifice zones and sacrificed individuals. So in the case of coal mining, this is where the mines actually are, and these are the communities that live next to them, communities that will be polluted, that will have health consequences, that will have livelihood consequences because they are next to these activities. But at the same time, those communities can be forgotten, they can be ignored in decision making because they are just not visible enough. So a system continues that contains as one of its conditions of possibility that some people and some areas would be sacrificed. Well, thank you, and I would welcome any comments on these, as this is a work in progress.
Hello, so we've got until past for comments and questions. And I'm going to interrupt if people make long comments that are not related to what the speakers have said. Comments are allowed, but please, not long soliloquies. The man with the hand, please hand up.
So I wanted to push both of you a little bit on the history of violence in your presentations. So with Jacinto, I wanted to ask, for me in some ways starting with neoliberalism is a little bit dissatisfying, because all of these societies in Latin America have long histories of violence. And especially if you're comparing Ecuador and Brazil, right? One of the key questions for me would be, what are the historical dynamics of violence, and then how does the neoliberal moment reflect that violence? So I guess what I wanted to push you on was a little bit is reflecting on sort of the history of violence, how contemporary violence in Ecuador and in Brazil is grounded in particular historical experience a little bit, and then how neoliberalism is affecting that. I think you did a good job of discussing neoliberalism generally, but I'm interested in that historical grounding. And for the second speaker, I think you did a great job with historical grounding, of talking about, the experience of apartheid and the experience of, colonialism and the violences associated with that, and the way in which that led to dynamics of exploitation that are being reproduced today. What was less clear to me, and what I wanted to learn a little bit more about from you, is how the violence today is different. Right? What's different about what's happening today than what might have happened in these same places under apartheid or under colonialism?
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. My question goes to Vic quickly. I saw the photograph that you said you didn't take. The question that I have is, then what happened to those kids? They go home, airbrush, and then what? Do you understand? But why I'm saying this as research, as we research and keep data, alone, I don't think it's sufficient in a country such as South Africa. I think we really need to go just beyond, writing papers and criticizing our academic colleagues. Thank you.
Two more questions over there, and then we're going to close. Yeah, two more questions, Jackie and Stu.
Thanks very much for both presentations, which were fascinating. But I wanted to ask Victor, if I can push him a bit, on this question of ecological invisibility, because you quite correctly talked about how in South Africa the damage and the violence of coal mining and burning is very visible. But it seems to me that there's a massive problem of people not seeing this violence. And it's not just a question of normalization. I think it's something deeper and more sinister, which applies to a lot of ecological abuse, so that people don't think when they flick a switch to connect to electricity, of what it means for people, especially coal workers and people living in coal-affected communities. And the same would apply to turning on the tap for water. So there's a kind of, it's almost as though people are lobotomized and fail to see the connections in the chain of coal. And I think it's a crucial question for us to address if we're trying to build a mass movement and deepen people's understandings.
Thanks. One first to Jacinto, which is, I think the proposal looks really interesting. The thing that slightly worried me about one element of it was just to be aware, and I'm sure you are, so forgive me, that linking informal work with criminal activity can have appalling consequences for informal workers. We saw that in Johannesburg 2 weeks ago, where there was a mass police raid of a community largely of migrant informal sector workers, which resulted in a riot in the street and followed up by gross police violence with 800 arrests of migrants, 39 of which have been evicted from the country or about to be without any process whatsoever, and reinforced this whole idea of xenophobia. And I think that's something to be very, very careful of, about how you separate that. And the other side of that, of course, is that one of the big problems that informal sector workers face here is violence from the police, because there was a pushback from the migrant community because they were sick and tired of the police stealing their goods because they said they were fake and so on, and then were caught selling them back to the traders. And 10 of them are currently in the process of being prosecuted. So it's just that sensitive area that I think needs to be carefully looked at. And then just on Victor's really fascinating presentation was not to forget, of course, the violence between workers, underground in particular. And 3 weeks ago there was an industrial dispute in this country of women mine workers striking against sexual harassment underground from other workers and from supervisors. So I think there's an interesting dynamic to be resolved there as too. Thank you.
Who would like to answer first?
Thank you for your comments and questions. Thank you very much. I'm gonna start with Jackie's question. I think it's a very big question, and I think there are many different answers. I think historically, people have believed, especially in the West, that they can't affect the environment. So that's a belief that sits in our culture that's difficult to get around. Although obviously now with climate change and with many other ecological barriers that are breached and that are being discussed, there is a potential for this to change. But what it takes to change is a change in understanding, and some of those, sometimes it's really hard to work through. Sometimes it's difficult science, or sometimes it's things that kept away. So when we switch on a light, this electricity, we experience it as clean. We don't experience the smoke and the ash and everything that goes into burning coal. But it also takes an attitude that I think once you become an activist, you realize as an environmental activist that, you know, I went through a phase where I felt responsible for every bit of paper and every cup that came out of a moving vehicle and fell on a sidewalk. And then you realize after a while that it is impossible to pick up all of other people's rubbish, which they just throw away. But the flip side of that is once you start feeling responsible for the environment, for the planet, for the places we live in, it's a huge task, and it can be scary and it can be depressing. So the answer to that really is solidarity and organizing and doing it with other people. So I think to move to Desmond's question, there are real differences from the colonial and apartheid era, and that is the legal space that is opened up. So one of those spaces are environmental regulations and environmental laws. So we have a very active engagement with Parliament and with the courts and so on. So there are many activists who work really hard to get much more progressive laws implemented. There's a space for activism itself, but the power structures of our society, the political processes may have changed, but the economic power structures are still the same. And it's those structures that produce pollution, and it's those structures that make decisions. So if you're the owner of capital, you own a company, then you make those decisions alone, you don't make them democratically. And I think that is where we really sit. So, Kenny, what happens to those kids in the water? Through many years of research, I've been to this area as Vosman in Malahleni. So we've spoken to their parents. Their parents say, we can't keep them out of these dangerous places because there are no recreational facilities. Some of those parents are involved in activist organizations, so this work is not just research, including the swap work. We go to communities, we listen to what their issues are, we listen to what their agendas are, we connect them to organizing activists who organize them, to NGOs who organize there. So we take a very, very active role, because I fully agree with you. Just to observe and write it down actually makes no sense. You know, the point of researching is to change it. And then I haven't done much work with the trade unions and with mine workers underground, so I take note of it, but I can't really comment on that, Steve. I hope I've answered everybody more or less.
Thank you for the questions. I'm going to ask maybe the more politically sensitive question first. I'm going to answer that question first. And yes, of course, I agree and I'm aware of all the risks involved in speaking of those connections and potential overlap between informal and criminal, to the extent that branding informal workers as criminals is a very common rhetorical strategy for those who are against informal workers and for repressive campaigns. So I'm totally aware of that. I do my best. If you read the work that I've written about informal street vendors, I think you're going to see that I oppose that confusion. And I think it's harder though when you're conducting an analysis at a more macro level and you're looking at more structural dynamics. Inevitably, there will be a point where you have to consider the fact that certain trades within the informal economy that are not criminal as such, and without never branding those who pursue those trades as criminals, may push some of those workers towards certain activities that are closer to the criminal economy. And if you're looking at it at a structural level, then I think that if it is a criticism, but I don't think it was so much a criticism as more like a warning of something that again I understand and I'm aware of. But you do have to understand to if you want to analyze that interface which exists, and as a matter of fact, many of the informal workers that I met, or some of the informal workers that I met in the streets of Brazil, had engaged in, for example, drug dealing, or were considering engaging in theft. I mean, it is a reality that you want to analyze, and I'm not sure exactly how you have to manage that. And I think maybe one way of doing this, which is something that a lot of people who study simply like poor people, like sociologists working on poor areas, where of course all this kind of branding as criminal, as dangerous people is widespread, and they're fighting against that discourse, while at the same time encountering many of those practices during their fieldwork. I think a common strategy that we use, and maybe I should have used at the beginning of my talk and did not, is to just preface your analysis by saying, mind you, I'm not calling informal workers criminals, and I'm very aware of the distinction, and I'm very aware of the potential for misinterpretation, but this is what I'm doing, right? And yes, maybe that I should have done that, and in any case, I am aware of that problem. And yet, I also see a need, at least at a structural level, of analyzing that interface, and that's what I am trying to do, or will try to do in this project. As far as the other question concerning how does the historical background of violence plays into what I want to study here, I agree that there is this pitfall of simply saying, well, these are violent societies, they have a history of violence, colonialism, imperialism, whatever, and then just moving to the kind of violent dynamics that you are studying without necessarily drawing the link. And I think that this is a similar pitfall maybe to simply saying neoliberalism created violence, now let's look at what's happening in this neighborhood. And yes, it's an analytical exercise that I had not really made and that you're forcing me to make right now. And there is evidently that the kind of violence that I'm mostly focused on in this project is interpersonal violence of the like street crime type, and the structural conditions of that kind of violence, at least according to the hypothesis that I'm proposing to test, would be lack of economic opportunities in the formal sector, of course, but also, and that's the claim about what economic restructuring has caused, in the informal sector. The idea would be that even in the informal sector, some of these workers no longer have a way to make a living and therefore are pushed towards more criminal type of activities. Now, how do you relate that to the legacy, the historical legacy of violence in those countries? It's not easy, but if maybe, and this is only one hint, and it's speculative. If you consider where do these young, poor, urban populations who in the 50s and 60s had a way of making a living in the informal sector and are more and more constrained in those activities, at least that's like the broad historical narrative that I'm banking on, where do they come from? Then, of course, I think you can find a link to many different types of violence, including the social structures of the agricultural economy and how that produced migrations from the countryside to the city, which is not, of course, the only factor, but there's definitely violence involved in that, and there's definitely, it played a role in creating a population that is at the margins of the social order in the cities, and that has very limited access to economic opportunities. So that would be one way, but in any case, I understand the question, and I think it requires reflection. There's one last point I want to make, which relates to the other question, in fact, and which is, what about the violence that these people are experiencing from the state? And then again, like if you look at my ethnographic work about the daily lives of street vendors in Brazil, that violence it's widespread. It's widespread, and I would argue is also a factor behind. I mean, again, this is just a hypothesis, but it's also a factor behind maybe the decision in some cases, or some of the constraints that push some of those workers towards illegal activities, to the extent that the state does not allow them to carry out the kind of daily work that they are carrying out for a living in the absence of other opportunities, which are related to the social structure of the countries where they are. Yes, of course, that violence can be also a factor that generates more violence in that sense. Thank you.
So Carl, we've caught up 15 minutes, so we're only 15 minutes late for tea. So should we go to tea, or do we open up for another round of questions?
Well, dictatorially, I'd say we have another round of questions. I mean, yeah.
As long as you're not worried about
time is not that, given the structure of today, we can afford a little bit of sliding on time. So well done on catching up 15 minutes. Now we can have some more discussion.
Okay, all right. We'll slide. So thank you very much for that round of questions. None of those questions were soliloquies. And can I ask in the next round of questions that we, again, avoid soliloquies? Carl?
So my question is, I've got two questions, a question for Jacinto and a question for Victor. So for Jacinto, I'm wondering what your concept of violence is actually, and what the kind of correlation is that you're drawing, because it looks like a kind of a big picture correlation, let me put it that way, which doesn't explore the workings of the violence. And it seems to me that to really establish why violence exists, one needs to pursue the reasons and the forms and the, I suppose to some extent, the functions of the violence. And now I'm wondering whether part of your hypothesis is that in the informal sector and the criminal economy, but as much in the informal sector that's not criminal as in the criminal, violence is a mode of regulation. Which I know, I mean, you've done work on that before, in the market in Buenos Aires, you know, the informal market, in an informal sector that is not regulated by the state. How else is it regulated than through violence? So I'm wondering what the notion or concept of violence is in your work. For Victor, I was left uncertain about what work your concepts of ecological violence are doing. What are they helping you to understand? And that's my question to you.
Are there any other questions?
I can rephrase my
No,
question,
no,
if you don't mind.
No.
Oh, okay.
Anyone else? Okay, well then
I'd like to ask a question of Desmond, given his question to them about how the neoliberal moment inflected prior histories of violence. And just, you know, in South Africa, what we're seeing now is violence taking a very, very similar form to the form it took during colonialism and apartheid. So in a way, does that not lead us to compare the forms of violence then, the forms of violence now, and what's different? What changed in that intervening period? Or is that more or less the same question as you're asking them? So maybe if you could both answer Carl's question, and then if you could answer mine.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, yes, this is kind of a wild adventure that I threw myself into by wanting to capture both the big picture of increases in violence, which are statistically very difficult to capture, and the data that I propose to use, which is a very imperfect data, is homicide rates, right? And when I try to connect that to the more micro level, which is the third part of the research strategy, it would be through interviews with ideally informal workers, so who are working in the streets, as well as maybe inmates who can tell me about their past and what kind of economic activities they've had over the years, right? And when and why they engage in crime. And so, in the way that I imagined this, and I agree that there are several weaknesses, the violence that I was thinking about was economically motivated interpersonal violence, like petty crime on the streets, driven by lack of income or other economic opportunities. Now, to what extent does that form of violence reflect or is reflected in the homicide rates that I would use to study this transformation at the macro level? I agree that this is a complicated question. Part of it may be, part of those homicide rates may be related to many other dynamics that do not necessarily connect to the kind of interpersonal violence that I was gonna investigate at the more like micro level through the interviews.
Thank you. Very worthy question. I think it's one of those questions that would have been nice to shift to the next phase of work, but I'm going to make an attempt. A lot of what I did in this presentation was actually a type of sorting to reduce the levels from 7 to 3, and then to identify underlying principles that can be used. Still, the question, the question still remains. So, if I'm again starting from the back, if you see ecological violence as systemic, it raises a question of whether humans or human societies can coexist with other forms of life and with ecosystems without violence. So is sacrifice really necessary? Can it be avoided? Now, many conservative approaches to the environment, from business, for example, will tell you that basically you have to break the eggs to make an omelette type of attitude. But as an optimist, I'm asking the question, is it really necessary to have a systemic violence to the environment and to people? So I haven't asked that question yet, and I haven't looked at the material from that point of view, but I think that's the potential of the systemic violence concept. In terms of contestation, that raises questions about contestation. So in the field, we were working with activists. On this point, people are asking questions about democracy. How does decision making work? How are people included in decision making? And how can we change that decision making? So that is the work that I hope that this concept of ecological contestation will do. And if you look at Martinez Alier's work, he has many case studies where he illustrates that. And then, in terms of understanding the ecological violence as violence to the web of life, that relates to the arguments where we've come to a point where we can no longer divide nature and society. And there are many implications to this way of thinking. And some of those implications are that there are certain freedoms that people, institutions, and businesses take under the misguided belief that they and their actions are separate from nature. So I see a potential, but I haven't used these concepts yet.
Can I just make a comment before Desmond gets to? Yeah, because, and it relates to the question that you and Inka asked about how in South Africa the continuity between the forms of violence under apartheid and some of the violence that we've talked about today is pretty evident, right? You can clearly see it, and you can draw that link. When you think about Latin America, I think it's there in a way, but it's harder to draw because we did not have until the 90s a system that was as explicitly violent and exclusive as apartheid was here. But then the question I would ask would be, what about the other types of violence that you see in South Africa today? For instance, car hijackings, muggings, this kind of common crime that you see on the streets. When you try to draw the link between those type of violence, which, as I understand, have also increased in the post-transition era and the apartheid regime, then does it get more complicated? Can you still draw the link? Is it still obvious, or how do you go about doing that? Because I felt that this is kind of what I was asked, and I think that there is one, but I also think that it's a difficult one, and that it takes investigation. It's not something that you can just derive from basic knowledge of the history of violence of the country and the current situation.
Thank you. Do you need a mic?
Yeah, well, that'll help. Yeah. So I mean, to answer your question, in all the countries I've worked in, but in particular in Jamaica, Brazil, and Colombia, right? There's this very distinct history of violence in these societies. It starts out with colonial expropriation, slavery, the expropriation of the wealth of people's labor over history, right? You end up with a lot of wealth inequality. And over time, right, there's contention in societies, conflict, revolutionary moments. And as you move into the 20th century, in the societies that I've worked in, you get processes of unionization, you get demands for popular incorporation, and the different political parties respond, right? You get periods of incorporation, right, in the early 20th century, and then you get periods of repression, right? You get, the Argentine dictatorship, the dictatorships in Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, and those exclude people again. And then those end, right, and you again have a new process of incorporation. But all of those processes of incorporation are incomplete, they're mixed, right? And so you get work by people like James Holston and Teresa Caldera that talks about disjunctive citizenship, right? And disjunctive democracy and Holston's concept of insurgent citizenship is very much how people in Brazil are responding to that incompleteness, right? But my own work about violence in these countries is also about the way in which this incompleteness becomes entrenched, right, and eventually generates, if you look at what Acacio was talking about earlier in the case of Brazil with the murder of Marielle Franco and the ascendancy of criminally linked right-wing extremists to be president, right, contradictions that eventually out of fear of crime lead to the diminishment of those democracies and the foreclosure of the possibilities that were opened up by that incorporative period, and the initiation of new processes of exclusion and closings. So when I'm listening to you guys talk about South Africa in this particular moment today, I see the apartheid regime as a fundamentally exclusionary regime, quite similar, although very, very different in its own ways, to the dictatorships of Latin America. And I see the post-apartheid democracy as an incorporative period, but an incorporative period that's imperfect and that has its own contradictions, and that has a tendency of reproducing a lot of these same violences from these earlier periods, in part because the interests of capital are still aligned with those types of repression and those same exclusions. And so what I'm looking at in different societies is trying to understand how these processes are repeating themselves, but also how people are responding to that and seeking ways out.
Okay, now hands are going up. Well, so be it on your head, Carl. And now I see why you allowed more questions, because you had questions to ask. Okay, go for it. Who else wants to ask a question?
So mine is a comment on the comments. I mean, what I'm wondering, it does seem to me that something that's distinctive about the Latin American series of cases is a kind of, it's the wrong word to use, but let me just use it as a metaphor, the kind of outsourced violence to violent oligarchies, often in the rural areas. I don't think that historically the violence in South Africa has followed that particular form, which is why now you find in the legislature trying to almost like create violent oligarchy in the homelands again. So I'm just wondering whether there's a distinction in these historical modes of violence that might be worth pursuing further, and wondering where other countries on the continent, such as the countries of West Africa that Ramani was talking about, might fit into that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to the two presenters. I just caught the part about, Tabo's the name by introduction again. I just caught the part about addressing of ecological violence, and maybe I want to perhaps think through if this is by any way tied into the climate change, which is affecting different sectors in the South African context. First of all, I think you mentioned that there's quite a lot of destruction of soil because of certain weather patterns or certain pollutions that emanates from coal. I mean, for us, this begs a response, I guess, from policy and legislation as to how you deal with the environmental degradation because of certain emissions from the coal deposits. So how do you move away from that thermal, gradually sort of move away from that thermal industry for ecological concerns? And I just also wanted to, maybe could you make a link between how the soil gets eroded in terms of how it breaks down. Because I've seen a particular example of this within a patch of what was lawn, but then it's become silt.
So that's a highly technical issue. And can I ask Victor to give you the answer at tea time? Okay. And then do either of you want to respond to Carl's point?
It wasn't a question, I mean, it was a broader question fitting into, doesn't need to be answered now.
We can talk about it at tea.
So maybe we leave that as the final word. Okay, sure.
I just want to quickly observe that previous land grabs makes a big difference to present day contestation. So in the Mpumalanga area for the South Africans, you have basically a grid of white farms, and those farms, many of them have the real, let's call it localized violence, but also no access. So people who organize against coal mining are basically in townships, and they are people with very slender land rights, holding onto the land, but very little position to fight back from. Whereas we observe that in the Bantustans there's a much better organization, there's more intact economies and so on. So there's a sharp difference as a result of that history. Yes, I mean, okay, I'll take up the soil issue, but I do want to make one remark, is that soil ecosystems are much richer than what is above ground. So people who see soil as dirt are really mistaken, and there are many ways in which you can injure those soil ecosystems, particularly through mining.
Thank you. Well, it's 3:45 and it's tea time.